Hey everybody, my name is Milecia and I'm a developer advocate at Iterative.ai. So there I work on an open source tool called DVC, and it helps make machine learning projects a lot easier for machine learning engineers. So check that out if you're interested in it. But today I'm going to talk to you about using Storybook to maintain your components in Redwood. So we're going to talk about Storybook, Redwood, and component-driven development today. If you have any questions about this talk, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at FlippedCoding, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. So let's just jump right on into it and talk about component-driven development. This is something that we've all probably been doing in some way without giving it an official name. So if you work on the front end in React, Angular, Vue, Svelte, whatever your framework is, you've probably touched some component-driven development. And what this does, it helps you model your systems better. So instead of building each page in isolation where you have all of the components self-contained there, you're actually building these modular components that are very loosely coupled that can handle pretty much any state you throw at them. So instead of having all of these components scattered throughout all of these pages that do really similar stuff, and maybe just passing some props along would give that component the functionality that it needs, the styles that it needs, you can do that with component-driven development. And what that helps you do is, since you're building these really modular pieces of code, whenever you're working with your data, you don't have to worry as much about one particular page. So you have these components that accept different kinds of props. They already handle the different states that you need when your data comes in. So you can reuse all of those components with whatever data that you need. You're not locked into just, well, this is on the user dashboard reporting page, so I can only use this component because it's the only thing that handles this data. Instead, you have a component you can use on that reporting page and on the settings page and maybe somewhere else within your app. So one example that we're going to stick with pretty much the whole time during this talk is a button. Because how many times have you had crazy things happen with buttons? So that is where Storybook comes in. This lets you develop your components in isolation, which is actually pretty awesome, because what that means is when you come up with these new states that, let's say our button needs to have a primary state for when a user is just looking at a form or they're in a modal or whatever, and we have a secondary state for, I don't know, the button's just in a different state. And then of course we have some kind of dark mode button. You don't necessarily want to have to run your whole app, change data, call APIs, or even just go in and manually tweak the code. So, you know, when you're doing your local development, you put in those weird conditions to get the components to show how you want them to do. Well, with Storybook, you don't have to do all of the, spaghetti code locally. You can actually just look at your components with different props applied to them without having to touch your app at all. So if we have this button component file, we can develop and see how that works in absolute isolation from the app. And something else that Storybook helps us do that really gets overlooked in, well, almost every part of software, unfortunately, documentation. You know, when you bring on somebody new to the team or you're working with components you haven't seen in a while, it might be hard to remember, you know, the names of the props, what values you can pass to the props, what that's actually supposed to do to the component itself, how that might interact with other things on the page. With Storybook, you can document all of that. You can leave examples of, let's say, our button component. You can leave examples of it in different states, show the different props that you need to set for the different scenarios and data that you'll be getting. Storybook bundles all of this together. You can look at the components in isolation, and you can document those components, I guess, in isolation too. So everything is really neatly put together. And this is one of the fun parts. When you're doing component-driven development in the first place, it makes writing tests a lot easier. But when you're doing it with Storybook, you're really focused on how your component should react with changes on the page. So again, if we have our button and we've just loaded in some data, maybe we need to change the state of that button to some kind of loading symbol that's a different color. And then after we have all of the data, we change it to something else. This is definitely some kind of functionality you would want to write tests for, right? So when you already have your component developed and set up in the way that Storybook needs to run with it, writing your test gets a lot easier because you can actually test the components in isolation. You don't need to render the whole page, make up the fake data, call the fake APIs, unless you know that's part of your test suite. But if you're just wanting to make sure your buttons are looking right, it makes it a whole lot easier. Or if you want to make sure that when data is loading into a certain component, that it updates correctly, this is a great way to take advantage of Storybook for testing. Now we're going to talk about how you actually use Storybook. So we're going to look at it inside of the Redwood framework, which is honestly just one of my personal favorite frameworks. And it's a full stack JavaScript framework, but you could also call it a full stack Jamstack framework. So I've heard some comparisons to Next, but I think it's a little better, maybe. That might just be because I like how much it handles for you out of the box. So with Redwood, you have your React front end, you have a GraphQL server for the back end, and you have Prisma supporting all of your database operations. So when you create a new Redwood app, you have a fully functional full stack app from front end to database as soon as you run the app. Like, you just create a new project, you run it, and you have this React front end, you have this GraphQL server, you have Storybook. If you want to add some authentication, you can do that too. But Redwood just handles a bunch of stuff for you out of the box, but it doesn't keep it hidden from you. So you can go in and edit any of the files. If you go through their docs, you can see how they structure things and why they do file conventions the way that they do. But Redwood has all of this for you, and there are a lot of commands that you can use to generate code that really makes development oddly fast. It almost feels like you're cheating, but at the same time, you still have to go in and change things to fit your business needs, but it just does. It does a lot. So let's just look at what it's like to work with a new project in Redwood. And we're going to focus on making this button component that I've been talking about this whole time. So I'm going to switch over to VS Code. And here you see what a fresh Redwood app looks like. And I've learned from doing this a few times not to install the framework live because it it takes a while. So I don't want to have to sit here and ramble for 5 minutes while this loads everything in the background. But if you do want to follow along, you can type in yarn, create Redwood-app. And if you like TypeScript, you can just add this -- TypeScript option. If you don't, it's okay to work with just JavaScript files. Then the last thing we need to do is say the name of our app. So in my case, it'll be Storybook Demo, and then you would hit enter and it'll start making all of these files for you. So I'm going to delete that out of the terminal. But once that command finishes running, you'll see all of these files that I have over here. But our main focus is going to be typically on this API folder and this web folder. So the API folder, it handles where we connect to our database and make our schema. It handles how we define our GraphQL types and the resolvers that we'll be using. So everything for our database and GraphQL server happen right here in the API folder. But where we're going to be focusing today is the web folder. This handles all of the front end for us. So this is where all of our React is. This is where all of our components will be. But we'll start. I just want to show you that this is really as cool as I say it is. So I'm going to run the app before we make any changes. That way you can see it in the browser when it finishes doing its stuff here. All right, so I'll switch over to my browser. It's always so much fun trying to switch between screens. Let me make sure I got the right button. Yay! So this is what it looks like when you run your Redwood app without making any changes at all. We're gonna follow this little recommendation here, and we're gonna make a home page. So I'm gonna come back over to VS Code and show you a Redwood command. So gonna keep the app running in the background and open a new terminal. And here we're gonna run yarn Redwood generate page, and we're so creative, so we're just going to call it home, and we're going to assign it to our root URL. Oh, might need to use the right version of Node. That always trips me up. But just going to run that command now. And what this is going to do, Redwood is going to generate these 3 files here for us. So if I come over in the web directory and look under source pages, you'll see this new home directory. And it's pretty cool because Redwood makes this test file for you. It makes a Storybook story for you, and it makes the component for you. It also updates the routes for you. So anytime you need to add a new page, you can just run that command and get all of this functionality for free. But now that you've seen how we make a new page, I want to show you how this Storybook component looks, just to give you an idea before we make our button. So I'm going to run yarn Redwood Storybook. And yeah, this is going to start up our Storybook server. So just going to let it finish web packing. Perfect. And I'm going to switch to the browser. Yes. Okay. This is what Storybook looks like with that home page component. So let's say you had some particular page, maybe it's a report page, and you're only supposed to show certain columns and tables if a user has a certain set of permissions. You could use this Storybook page to toggle between those different states without actually touching your app here. So all of the changes that you want to make, or the different scenarios you want to see, you can do that right here in your story. And now that you've seen that, let's make our button finally, and then you'll see how all of this ties together. So back here in VS Code, I'm gonna risk it and open another terminal and hope that I don't forget the other ones are open. And we're gonna run yarn redwood generate component, and we're finally gonna make that button once I change my node version again. So now we're gonna make that button. All right. It did something super similar to our page. Of course, we don't have a new route for the button. Thankfully, the button doesn't need a route. That would be weird. But we have those same files. We have this sample test, we have our story, and then we have the component itself. Now we're going to get into where Storybook and component-driven development actually matters. So, we've already installed the styled component library. That's just how I like to do my styles. You can use CSS if you like. And yeah, I'm gonna make it like this. But I'm gonna come down here and make this styled button. It's gonna be styled button. I love how creative programming is with the terminology. And then I'm actually going to cheat a little and just copy and paste some code in here. So what we're doing is taking a prop inside of this styled button, and based on the type of button we're working with, it'll update the background color and the text color for our button. Let me add some commas, right? I'm not sure why I did the thing with the weird quotes, but I'm gonna fix that because it'll bug me if I don't. So we're gonna just use double quotes everywhere. But that's pretty much what's happening here. We have this styled button, and based on the type of button, we'll change some colors. So up here in the actual component, I'm gonna cheat a little bit again and just copy and paste some code in here. And this is our actual button. This is it. Maybe I'll drop it like this just so it looks like we have a little bit more, but this is it. This is the button. You see we're taking in two props here. We're taking in the type and the label. So the use case for this would be, let's say you have a form that a user is filling out. When they're typing in their data, maybe you want it to be grayed out or a different color. You give it a different message telling them they can't save till they finish the form. You'll pass that type and that label in, it'll display the text here, and it'll change the style of the button based on what type you passed in. Usually, if you were checking the different states for this button in the app itself, you would probably have to manually update the type every time you want to check the styles. You would probably have to do some kind of weird local janky code just so that you could see the different possibilities for the state of this button. But with Storybook, we have this story here, and I'm actually just going to go ahead and delete that out because we really don't need it. So we're going to import our button like this. Since we didn't we did export it as the default. Never mind. Let me save that. and undo that. So we got a clean component here. And speaking of which, we're going to make this component the button. This is just some Storybook stuff that helps with organizing things and letting you know what you're working with. If you want to learn more about the particulars, you should definitely go look at their docs, because it will explain it a little bit better than I will right now. So with this empty story, let's make our template. To make the template, we'll just make this template variable where we take in the arguments that we pass to the button. So with this template, we're going to be able to pass in all kinds of combinations of types and labels to see what this component would look like with these different states. That is what our template and our args let us do. So with the template in place, let's take a look at what it would be like to make a primary button. Basically, we are exporting this primary button that's bound to our template. So primary is going to take in these args to tell the button what to render. And what that means is primary is just this button with these args applied to it. So if I save this and come back to Storybook, because I can definitely switch between screens. All right, so now you see here in our Storybook, we have our button finally, and it's our primary button. It's not that impressive right now, but let's add a few more buttons just so you can see how Storybook handles these different states. I'm gonna copy and paste this a couple of times. And I'm gonna call this secondary and update all of this stuff. And then I'm gonna make this the dark button because a lot of apps have dark mode now, right? So we've updated this Storybook story to have 2 more buttons with these different states. And now we're going to look at what happened in our browser, which you should see these other components down here. So now you have a quick view at what the secondary button looks like, what the dark button looks like. It's all there, and you don't have to go in your code and change anything. You can just come back here to this story and update whatever you need. So anytime you change this component, you can come into your story, add the props that documents the new component, and it also shows off how the new component works. So you get a bunch of benefit just packed in here. But this is how Storybook is so useful with component-driven development. Just imagine how useful this is with the table. I can tell you, it's pretty useful because those usually have all kinds of crazy data floating around. Sometimes you don't have complete data, so there's columns missing. Maybe you need to render a weird empty state because of reasons, and it's hard to test that when you're just doing that in a running app locally. There's so many things that you have to tweak in the code to force those changes onto components that aren't built in isolation, that it makes you be extra careful before you push your code up for a PR review. But that is what I wanted to teach you all about Storybook today. So I'm gonna switch back over to my slides and tell you how to add Storybook to an existing project. Because maybe you aren't working with Redwood. Maybe you aren't ready to make that jump and you have some kind of just a regular React app or whatever you're working with. It's pretty easy to add Storybook. you just run this command in the root of your project and it'll set up the Storybook configs for you. You can go through the docs and look at some of the add-ons that are there, but it's pretty easy to just throw this into any existing project. That is all you have to do. Do those configs and then debug it, because it's never that easy. But in theory, you just do this command. And I guess my doggo wanted to join me for the very end. Well, that's fine, because we are at the very end. So I just want to wrap up with a few key takeaways. Component-driven development really does make long-term maintenance easier if for no other reason you have your props in different states documented. So when business needs change, you can actually see the evolution of how the components changed. And when you bring on new people, when you're jumping around products that are in your company, or if you're a freelancer and you're just hopping in all over the place, having that kind of documentation and that ability to work on components in isolation makes projects way more pleasant to work with. And then Redwood just bootstraps a bunch of stuff for you. So if you did want to use the GraphQL server, there's one command that takes your schema and it literally makes the whole app for you. Like, it makes the GraphQL server, it makes the types, the resolvers. On the front end, it makes the pages and these components, and it fetches the data. Redwood does a lot, so you should probably just check it out. And then my favorite, keep trying new things. There are so many new tools out here that it's kind of crazy sometimes. You don't have to stick with everything you try. Just take a look at what's going on, and maybe it'll give you some ideas for things that you're already working on, or you might get a fresh perspective on some problem you've been stuck on. And one other thing, I know sometimes as developers, we're like, oh, I need to build this from scratch to prove that I'm so good at code. You really don't. That's the secret. You really don't have to prove that. Because there's so many tools out here, if you know how to use them and you know what's going on under the hood, you're fine. Just use the tools. Don't spend a week trying to make, well, if you could make your own framework in a week, that would be pretty crazy. But just don't waste your time trying to make a framework when there's a bunch of frameworks out here that you can try, and maybe later, after you've tested everything out, then you can make your own thing because you see the gaps. But I digress. Keep trying new stuff. That's all I have for you. I hope that you learned something. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter @FlippedCoding.